Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. Congress is hustling to vote on a range of legislative issues before the clock runs out. But Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer appears to be backing away from a self-imposed Christmas deadline to pass the president's social and climate spending plan. The person who could make or break that plan is West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, who continues to express reservations about the bill. The president visited Kentucky today. The state is one of several hit hard by a series of rare December tornadoes over the weekend. At least 74 people died in Kentucky alone.
I've been involved in responding to a lot of disasters, and you can see it in people's faces what they're really looking for. And look around, I say to the press, what they're looking for is just to be able to put their head down on a pillow, be able to close their eyes, take a deep breath, go to sleep and make sure their kids are okay. That's what people are looking for right now. But a lot of hard work is going to happen in the next 2 and 3 months to bring it all the way back.
New polling out today from Politico and Morning Consult shows a majority of Americans do not want their respective parties' standard bearers to run for president in 2024. 56% of Americans want former President Trump to sit it out, and 58% do not want President Biden to run for re-election. The issues registering as the most important for Americans going into the midterms are all economic: taxes, wages, jobs, unemployment, and spending. Those issues poll over twice as high as what follows: issues related to security. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve is rolling out a plan to help fight the high rate of inflation. The central bank will wrap up its pandemic-era stimulus program earlier than planned and expects to raise interest rates more in 2022. Here's some of what Chairman Jerome Powell had to say.
Economic activity is on track to expand at a robust pace this year, reflecting progress on vaccinations and the reopening of the economy. Aggregate demand remains very strong, buoyed by fiscal and monetary policy support and the healthy financial positions of households and businesses.
For more, let's bring in Natalie Brand, David Drucker, and Amber Phillips. Natalie reports on the White House and Congress for CBS News. David is a senior correspondent for the Washington Examiner and author of the new book, In Trump's Shadow: The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP. And Amber is the author of the 5-Minute Fix newsletter and a political reporter at the Washington Post. Welcome to all of you. David, let me start with you. President Biden toured Kentucky today, a state represented by 2 Republican senators. Both Rand Paul and Mitch McConnell applauded the federal response, but Senator Paul has taken criticism for that. Why?
Well, because in the past, Senator Paul, who leans a little bit libertarian on fiscal issues and foreign policy issues, has opposed federal aid to help states and local governments, local communities recover from natural disasters like the one that his state just experienced. And of course, whenever you're a politician that takes issue with federal spending, it's tricky because eventually one day you're going to want that same federal spending. Senator Paul is doing exactly what he needs to do to win re-election in 2022. He's up. He's doing exactly what his constituents expect him to do. I don't think Republicans in Kentucky are going to care one whit that he seems a little bit hypocritical on the issue of disaster relief and how involved and how much money the federal government should be and spend. But naturally, for Democrats and Republicans in Washington that have been on the receiving end of Rand Paul's opposition to some federal spending bills that included billions of dollars in very desired natural disaster relief, he's going to face a lot of criticism and naturally criticism from political opponents who are going to note the hypocrisy of it all. But this is one of those things that happens in Congress. If you're here long enough, you've opposed things on principled grounds, but often that is tested, and obviously that is being tested here. But if you look at the politics of this, both as a Republican, as a Kentuckian, Rand Paul wasted no time in requesting federal disaster relief, so you can see where his head is on this issue.
Yeah, David, it's interesting. Just very quickly, what comes to mind is that infamous hug, if you remember, or embrace after Superstorm Sandy in the tri-state area. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, right, faced some criticism for embracing then-President Obama. It was something that I recall, conservatives took note of. Is there a comparable kind of situation here or not really?
So I don't think this is comparable because that happened in the home stretch of a competitive presidential campaign And Chris Christie was a sort of a conservative folk hero at the time, had been a virulent Obama critic. And what a lot of Republicans thought Christie did was above and beyond what they felt he needed to do. He needed to work with the federal government. He needed to request disaster aid. He needed to get along well with federal officials. A few weeks out from a presidential race, a very partisan Republican is seen hugging and talking warmly and saying wonderful things about Barack Obama and his leadership. And so even though that was the right thing for Chris Christie to do for his state at that time, he's talked about it since. He has no regrets, and he said it's exactly what he needed to do. It bothered Republicans because they thought it lent Barack Obama the imprimatur of being a bipartisan, even-handed deal maker and politician at a time when both Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, who's now a senator from Utah, were competing heavily for the votes of independents in those swing states. That race finished, if you remember, extremely close in some battleground states, and some Republicans blame Christie for that.
Yeah. I guess the idea being proximity to Election Day is really what matters here. All right. So, Natalie, turning back to today, so Senator Joe Manchin seems poised once again to be the do or die vote for the president's social spending plan. What's the latest on where he stands?
Well, Elaine, that is the $1.75 trillion question here on Capitol Hill. That, of course, is the size of the president's and the House-passed social spending bill that still kind of remains in limbo, in question, ahead of this proposed Christmas deadline that initially proposed, we know, by the Senate Majority Leader. But what we know at this point is that conversations between Senator Manchin and the White House continue over the haggling over the size and scope of this bill, which we know that Senator Manchin has expressed some concerns about. Now, Senate Majority Leader Schumer was asked today about all of this and said, those conversations are continuing. When he was asked if he was optimistic about a Christmas deadline, he did not respond. And one more note from the White House, they would not go into the details. They said it's their policy not to talk about the nature of the negotiations, but characterize the conversations between the president and Senator Manchin as productive and friendly. We know that the president himself has said he wants to get this bill passed as soon as possible, but he has not put as clear or definitive of a timeline on it, Elaine.
Well, Amber, Senator Manchin is also poised to potentially block Democrats' efforts to get a voting rights bill passed. How so?
Yeah, that's right. So unlike Biden's spending bill, every single Senate Democrat, Manchin included, is on board with this big voting rights legislation. What they want to do is they want to create a national standard for how people vote, like 2 early weeks of voting. They want to allow mail-in ballots. They want to make Election Day a holiday. Where Manchin is not on board is how to get this passed. Republicans are going to filibuster it. Manchin so far has been not okay with eroding and certainly not getting rid of the filibuster entirely to make the Senate work more like the House, where majority rules. But there are some signs that Democrats, Manchin included, are really feeling the pressure from their base to get this passed as soon as possible, ideally before the end of the year, so that this law can affect changes for the 2022 midterm elections. And to that end, I'm reading the tea leaves of Manchin's comments to reporters, and combined with my own reporting, I think he could be open to tweaking the filibuster, perhaps by making it more painful for the minority party to execute. Would they have to say, talk until they drop, like Mr. Smith goes to Washington? And then would that make them less likely to filibuster this voting rights bill?
I mean, that's pretty, Amber, to think about that, though, that would seem to be quite a shift, to say the least, from where it was that can you just kind of put that into perspective for us? What does that say then about the amount of political pressure Senator Manchin is facing?
That's a great question, Elaine. At the beginning of this year, Senator Manchin wrote in the Washington Post, I'm summarizing, but no way, Jose, am I going to eliminate the filibuster. Absolutely not. He said a very firm line. All of a sudden this week, he's been more open to things. He met with a couple moderate fellow Senate Democrats who gave him some options. We don't know exactly what those were. And now he's telling reporters, as recently as today, if I were open to something, I would want it to be something that Republicans could support as well. He wants it to be bipartisan. So it's a massive shift, and it does suggest that Manchin is feeling the pressure just like every other Senate Democrat to get things done. Excuse me. I mean, Democrats have pointed out that he is a former Secretary of State. He understands how important elections are.
All right, to be continued then. David, a new Monmouth poll shows that 6 in 10 Americans say that they feel, quote, worn out by how COVID has impacted their lives. Now, the Omicron variant and an uptick in cases is raising the prospect of more public health restrictions. How could this impact the White House and the upcoming midterms?
Well, look, I think the White House is in a pickle here, and that's because, on the one hand, Joe Biden has a Democratic base that wants him, in many instances, to be even more aggressive in combating the coronavirus, in implementing vaccine mandates or other health restrictions to try and deal with the new variants that have come up and protect people from getting sick and reduce the caseload. And then on the other hand, you have independent swing voters, never mind Republicans, who really are, I think, worn out from all of this. In other words, they take the coronavirus very seriously. A lot of them, and I'm talking swing voters here, suburban swing voters, independents, they believe in getting vaccinated. They are vaccinated. Their kids are vaccinated, but they want to get back to normal. In fact, the vaccine is supposed to mean to them that life isn't risk-free, but I want to get back to normal. And so he's sort of caught in a vice here between trying to satisfy his base and trying to satisfy the electorate that's going to determine the outcome of 2022, not to mention 2024. And I don't know that he's able to satisfy anybody. And then on top of it all, and this is just, what happens when you're president. Joe Biden ran on shutting down the virus. He said, if you elect me, I'm going to do what my predecessor wouldn't, and we are going to finally put the pandemic to bed. And because of the evolving nature of the virus scientifically with new variants, because certain communities have been resistant to the vaccine, and just because of human nature, he's not been able to shut down the virus. And even though it's one of those things where presidents get more blame or credit than they deserve, a lot of voters elected him because he was the guy that was going to take this seriously and finally solve it. He hasn't, and he'll end up getting blame for that, and so will Democrats.
Right, because those folks will just see the results if there are, more public health restrictions that are continuing for a longer period of time. All right, on another topic, Natalie, the Senate passed a $786 billion defense bill on its way to becoming law once the president signs it. Now, this is a bill Congress has to pass every year, but what are some of the key provisions this time around?
Elaine, there are some key provisions for women in the military and also families and parents in the military. We've been talking about what's being billed as historic reforms regarding how sexual harassment and sexual assault in the military is investigated. The new bill would require an independent investigator, although some senators, including Senator Gillibrand, who had fought for tougher provisions, believe these current reforms do not go far enough. However, overall, they are being called by lawmakers and the White House as historic reforms, a positive step in the right direction. There's also an interesting provision on expanding parental leave to 12 weeks across all the services, which if you looked at how different branches were handling the issue of parental leave, there were some differences in this before. So this was a provision that was championed by Senator Duckworth, a mom and veteran herself. And so this brings the number to 12 weeks, standardizing parental leave. There's also a provision to address hunger in the military. Military families at the lower end of the pay scale, who we've reported on, CBS has done reports on military families having to turn to food banks and food pantries. This creates a basic needs allowance for those families, because this is an issue that has certainly gotten the attention of members of Congress, of course, and communities across America. And then from a national security standpoint, there's calls for a strategy regarding China and addressing Russian aggression. So those are some of the signals that is a key, obvious defense focus. And one other item to note is an independent commission to study the war in Afghanistan. And this would be a nonpartisan, completely independent panel trying to look at, assess mistakes made, and come up with some takeaways and lessons learned. Elaine.
That's notable. And there was, as we had reported, such bipartisan criticism of the way in which the United States carried out that withdrawal. Well, Amber, we have been following Mark Meadows' case this week. Last night, the House voted to hold him in criminal contempt of Congress. What are the biggest challenges to his case as opposed to Steve Bannon's?
Yeah, next up is for the Justice Department to decide whether to prosecute him. And like you said, they did with Steve Bannon. There are challenges, though. Legal experts I talked to point out that Meadows is trying to cite executive privilege. He was by the president's side. He could be reasonably expected to have private conversations without Congress trying to intrude on them. Bannon tried to claim that, but he wasn't an aide at the White House at the time. Meadows was at the very highest level of the White House on January 6th. That being said, the committee is arguing, well, you handed over thousands of pages of text messages and other documents. Why can't you talk to us about those? Meadows is actually suing the committee. He's taking a really aggressive stance to try to not talk to them. And that's the second reason it can actually be very difficult for the Justice Department to prosecute them. Legal experts I spoke to say that it's hard to sue Congress successfully, but at the very least, Meadows can gum up this process in a way that just makes it difficult for the Justice Department to go after him. They say, well, we're going to wait and let the courts decide, on that lawsuit. And by then, perhaps Republicans control Congress and they disband or severely weaken this committee. Then the final reason is that even if the Justice Department decides we're going to prosecute Meadows for not complying with a congressional subpoena, and that could be punishable by up to a year in jail, I talked to a former House lawyer who tried to prosecute a similar case in the 80s, and he said these are really hard to prove. You have to prove that the person being held in contempt absolutely did not cooperate with Congress, just thumbed their noses at them and refused to help at all. And like I said, Meadows has handed over thousands of pages of documents, and his lawyer continues to argue that they are trying to cooperate with Congress. They just don't like what Congress wants to talk to them about. So it could be a much more difficult road for Meadows to face jail time and for the Congress to try to put him there than Bannon, who has a trial in July for this very same question.
Well, David, you reported that the National Republican Congressional Committee is targeting 40 House Democrats in a series of new digital ads running through Christmas. What do these targets indicate about where Republicans are focusing their attention in the 2022 midterms?
Yeah, well, it indicates that they've seen redistricting unfold and they feel even more optimistic than they already were about picking up scores of seats in 2022. I mean, there are some seats like Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur in Ohio. She's perennially been safe and been in a pretty Democratic district. Nobody's bothered her. They're targeting her with this ad campaign. They think that the changes to her district make it ripe for a Republican takeover. Frank Mervyn, a Democrat in Indiana, congressman, he's being targeted by the NRCC, the National Republican Congressional Committee, for the very first time. They think that his seat is ripe for a takeover. What we saw with these 40 seats, because the ad campaign itself isn't funded with tons of money, but it gives you a sense of how good Republicans feel about the playing field. They only need to win about 5 seats. That's it to win control of the House. And they're going to win potentially a lot more than that, but they're going to be able to put the Democrats on defense in dozens of seats. And these 40 just kind of give you an indication of how they're slowly but surely expanding the playing field. By the time we get into next summer, they could have a target-rich environment of around 60, 65 seats, depending on how the president and Democrats are doing in the polls.
Interesting. Well, Natalie, President Biden has been in Kentucky surveying the damage from those tornadoes over the weekend. What did he say while touring the area today?
Yeah, Elaine, we saw him stopping to speak with families, and he said that this is an incredible group of people helping each other, pulling together, but obviously we know there's a lot of heartbreak and destruction, devastation. So he announced this afternoon, going back to the conversation about federal aid, that the federal government would be covering the costs entirely in terms of disaster response in Kentucky for the first 30 days. He also said that the federal government would be involved through the entire rebuilding process. And when talking to reporters, he noted the estimates that there have been $99 billion estimated in damage from extreme weather and climate change overall in this year alone. And when you look at some of the NOAA reports and the NOAA reporting over the past several years, they've noted new records when it comes to these destruction estimates related to extreme weather events that we've seen.
Natalie, David, and Amber, thank you all very much.